Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 12 of Series 10. The question for today is, does consciousness exist, or is it just a language game without an ontology? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 1, Section 2. A denial of the existence of consciousness has arisen out of linguistic philosophy, neuroscience, and postmodernism. This denial contradicts my account of consciousness as a fundamental explanation of human existence. It thereby also denies the ground of value as a principle of life and other substantive values. So I want to argue for the intuitively attractive position that consciousness does exist. But consciousness is an amorphous and insubstantial phenomenon that isn't so easily recognized and acknowledged. For example, I myself have long argued that consciousness has long been overlooked and neglected. This problem has been compounded by science insisting on quantifiable criteria of existence. And in the case of consciousness, the meaning of existence is especially uncertain. This problem of denial has also been exacerbated by linguistic philosophy promulgated by Wittgenstein. It does this because it turns philosophical issues into more convenient questions about language. One of many examples of this is the reconstruing of the mental state of intentionality as the linguistic structure of intentionality with an S, making it into a that statement, that something is the case. But like others, John Mackey is critical of linguistic construals of psychological states, and he questions how one psychological state of affairs, which is adequately described only through a partial description of a different merely possible state of affairs, that is, language. Yet the underlying denial of consciousness isn't a majority position, but it has some noteworthy advocates. That is, deniers of consciousness include Brian Farrell, Richard Rorty, and Paul Feyerabend. Daniel Dennett states that the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon. I agree that consciousness somehow does not exist, but somehow it does exist, and I want to explain how it does exist. And his qualifications don't mitigate his many such ambiguous statements. In a film skit, Robert Ford stated that we can't define consciousness because consciousness does not exist. But we have to define what we are arguing against. Otherwise we are just tilting at windmills or straw men like the soul or Daniel Dennett's Cartesian dualism. An initial response to the denial of consciousness might begin with Galen Strawson saying that this particular denial is the strangest thing that has ever happened in the whole history of human thought, not just the whole history of philosophy. And given the seemingly indubitable facts of I think therefore I am and the direct experience of mental states, the burden of proof is on the deniers of consciousness. Yet much of the evidence is in the form of error theory of how consciousness is overlooked. I will nevertheless also present both properties and functions of consciousness that demonstrate its existence. To preview that evidence, I can affirm the fact of my existence with a statement, I think therefore I am. Yet both consciousness and value represent many instances as well as realms of visceral experience, and these are expressed in such forms as morality, purpose, motivation, volition, aesthetics, romance, and religion. Further evidence is that these experiences held long-standing philosophical problems and questions, and arguably these questions can be answered by structures and principles of consciousness and value. The idea that they can be dissolved as linguistic anomalies, as Wittgenstein holds, is both fantastical and a trivialization of philosophy, as I intend to show here. But as noted, prior to asking whether anything exists, we must first define what is supposed to exist or not exist. This is especially important for consciousness, which is subject to many erroneous conceptions. These include the notions of a soul, a Cartesian substance, an essence, a transcendental entity, and consciousness itself can be mistaken as a mental state in a category mistake. Gilbert Ryle coined the term category mistake in his book The Concept of Mind to criticize the mind-body dualism. Ryle argued that dualists mistakenly treat mind as a distinct substance rather than a set of dispositions. For example, we might say that an apple is round, red and ripe, and then add that it exists. But it's a mistake to think that existence is a property of the apple, like round, red and ripe. That is a category mistake because existence represents all of those properties. But a basic and provisional definition of consciousness that avoids this error is given by John Searle. That is, he provisionally defines consciousness as all the mental states and experiences of which we are conscious. We will be able to give a much more detailed definition of consciousness shortly. Yet Searle's provisional definition of consciousness as a collective also initiates a case for its existence. That is, we are defining it as a collective concept that includes all the mental states that constitute it. And this definition of consciousness does more than avoid Ryle's category mistake. On this definition, consciousness is constituted by its mental states like pain, happiness, perception, and love. And we can accept that these states exist, and it follows that their existence as consciousness also exists. That is, as a collective concept like furniture is a collective noun of things like tables and chairs. But it may be denied that consciousness is a valid category or classification of those mental states. For example, Richard Rorty holds that cognitive and non-cognitive states don't seem to have anything in common except our refusal to call them physical, unquote. But not being physical implies that they are mental, and that this is the crucial common factor of the category of consciousness. Moreover, mental states aren't like items of furniture because they relate by interpenetrating and overlapping each other. Cognitive perceptions, for example, can overlap and produce non-cognitive states, and feelings can produce volition and action. And all these states are bound together in other ways, like by the faculty of personal identity. This is why consciousness is an amalgam rather than just a collection of states. This interactive relation is sometimes described as the binding problem of understanding these interrelations. But there's also the idea here that these interrelations produce more than the states themselves, to which we can apply Aristotle's saying that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But this also raises the problematic ghosts of essences, reification, objectification, and transcendental existences. And we will have to lay these to rest in the various guises in the following discussion. But before we look at some of the ways and theories in which consciousness is said to exist or not exist, we first need to understand what existence means here, especially given its checkered history. So we should replace it with questions about ontological status and the ontological status of consciousness. A basic typology could be matter, mind, and abstraction, drawn from Karl Popper's Three Worlds. Yet, firstly, Aquinas' concept of intentional inexistence was to account for conceptions of things that don't exist. This has taken such forms as, how can we say that the King of France is bald if there is no King of France? Tim Crane thinks this is one of the most puzzling and most discussed features of intentionality. To explain, Brentano reconfigured intentional inexistence as a structure of intentionality. But I think that Crane's puzzle is resolved with the idea of fictions as abstractions. That is, it is resolved by changing the issue from existence to ontological status. Yet this example introduces the issue of how different kinds of things are said to exist or not for different reasons. These include category mistakes, fictions, abstractions, feelings, and consciousness as pure appearance. And also in science, it is sometimes said, for example, that gravity does not exist as a force because it has now been reinterpreted in terms of space-time relations. I will say more on this with Daniel Dennett's scientific definition of existence. Another scientifically ambiguous case of existence is that of our everyday experience of matter. That is, since Rutherford's discovery of the nature of atoms, it could be said that matter doesn't really exist. This is because matter really exists as a vast empty spaces and relations between energies. What is interesting here is that reality, or what really exists, is defined by our experience. And we need to remember this ambiguity when we are talking about existence. Conversely, one of the most unambiguous denials of consciousness is Richard Rorty's disappearance theory of mind. On this view, mental states like pain and love are replaced by brain states and nerve fibers. And that talk about mental states are redundant, like talk about demons and witches are now. Yet disappearance theory of mind is a variant of eliminative materialism, that only material things exist. This view was held by W.V. Quine, Paul Churchland and Paul Feyerabend, but Feyerabend was open to other possibilities in his later years. Eliminative materialism was considered but rejected by Wilfrid Sellars, who distinguished between the manifest image of our everyday view of the world and the mind, and the scientific image of a scientific view. This distinction is relevant to the idea that reality, or what exists, is defined by our experience. But Sellars believed in the reductive materialism of mental states to physical states. Other denials are more like evasions of consciousness, such as behaviorism and functionalist theories of mind. They ignore subjective features like intention and experience and only pay attention to outcomes. Analytic philosophy may be less evasive, but still practices a form of evasive denial of consciousness in its emphasis on language, reason and logic that neglects mind except as a preference for physicalism. Relevant here is that the objective methods of analytic philosophy derive largely from science. And science has classically striven to remove the subjective observer from the picture. The above differences mark a development towards more ambiguous denials and an obfuscation of consciousness. And following this ambiguity and obfuscation will lead us to the root and the nature of this denial. On this path towards ambiguity and even plausible deniability, we encounter Daniel Dennett. Last week he saw that Dennett is basically a physicalist who believes that consciousness is an illusion. That is, like a computer image, it isn't real, with only a notional existence, like an abstract idea, like unicorns. One of his arguments is that consciousness has been reified into an object and is subject to unacknowledged error. I agree, but I'm disappointed that I can't find compelling arguments in Dennett that explains this error. If we could begin to understand why consciousness has been overlooked. To rectify this oversight, I later outline an error theory of consciousness of my own. Yet one of Dennett's main arguments against Cartesian dualism is of the Cartesian theater. In a Cartesian theater, images are supposedly projected onto some sort of screen within the mind. In this, there is thought to be a middleman or homunculus viewing or acting on events. Then it argues that these ideas are false and hence dualism is false. I agree with Dennett's rejection of 1. Cartesian dualism, 2. A Cartesian theater, and 3. A homunculus. But I disagree with his conclusions because the concept of consciousness need not appeal to these things. For instance, affect states like pain and pleasure aren't cognitive and need no theater, and cognitive states can be explained with externalist perceptions and internal abstractions. We should also note that Edmund Husserl had already rejected Descartes' theater over 100 years ago. Instead of this indirect perception, Husserl argued for the direct perception advocated by phenomenology. So Dennett's arguments against Cartesian dualism are really against a straw man. That is, Cartesian dualism only exists as an argument in freshmen's notebooks. It has no place in an informed discussion about the existence of consciousness, except of course to show how consciousness has been mistakenly thought not to exist. A third argument of Dennett against consciousness reveals his scientific materialism. He writes that the fundamentally anti-scientific stance of dualism is its most disqualifying feature. But there are at least 3 questionable implications here. 1. That dualism is anti-scientific. 2. That anti-physicalism must be dualist. And 3. That positivistic science is the right approach to understanding mind. And these points indicate Dennett's positivistic perspective and bias against consciousness. Yet Dennett's positivist scientific materialism is revealed elsewhere. That is, in his arguments that are also against the existence of the self by comparing it to a centre of gravity. He writes that a centre of gravity has no physical properties at all except for spatial temporal location. It is purely abstract object. It is, if you like, a theorist's fiction. It is not one of the real things in the universe in addition to the atoms, unquote. A centre of gravity, like a latitude and longitude, or even mathematics, is arguably an abstract idea. But it isn't a purely abstract idea or a theorist's fiction because it has a physical location. And even on a reinterpretation of the force of gravity as a relation in space-time, that centre or those relations have a physical status like latent energy or neutrinos. But Dennett's scientific materialism is literally materialistic and not just scientific if he excludes, as he does, purely abstract objects like scientific principles and mathematics that are abstract through and through. That is, he insists that, unlike atoms, the centre of gravity is not one of the real things in the universe. Given this kind of scientific materialism, we can see why Dennett, like others, thinks that consciousness and the self aren't real and don't exist. The final argument that I will take from Dennett is his parody, A Visit to the Phenomenological Garden. He argues that the contents of mental states aren't always what they seem to be. But this follows from our critique of the Cartesian belief in the transparency of mental content, and it is agreed that we can be mistaken about the contents of our own minds. But there are different types of mental content: cognitive, non-cognitive, unconscious and preconscious. And some mental states, like non-cognitive affect states and qualia, are constituted by their experience. And phenomenology accepts conscious experience as pure appearance of what it seems to be. But then it depreciates and downgrades the status of the experience of seeming to exist. This might be expected given Dennett's scientific materialism and his criteria of what really exists. There are at least three modes of existence: material, abstract and mental. But Dennett acts as if there were only one of these. But he is also confronted by the problem of having to dismiss phenomenology and existence as appearance. That is, as well as wrestling with the problems of scientific materialism and a straw man of dualism. Yet that does leave us with an understanding of how consciousness might be thought not to exist. I've discussed Dennett's arguments about the self, qualia, mems and multiple draft theory elsewhere. Yet his discussion on phenomenology leads us to another more subtle aspect of this denial of consciousness. That is, the Sartrean idea of consciousness as nothingness or a lack of being. But before that, I want to discuss a more oblique way that consciousness has been overlooked, neglected and denied. That is, Wittgenstein's methodological pessimism that refuses to talk about ethics, values and mental states. And this means that his resulting thin linguistic construal of the subjectivity of consciousness can be better approached through his account of the familiar subjectivity of ethics and values. His pessimism is seen in his statement, "It is clear that ethics cannot be put into words, ethics is transcendental." And again, in his own words, "What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence." But because ethics and values are manifestly put into words by many theorists, including myself, Wittgenstein must mean that a correct theory of ethics cannot be put into words. But his idea of a correct theory of ethics is deeply flawed. This is because he regards it as a transcendental, and that the sense of the world must lie outside the world, unquote. But modern philosophers, including myself, strongly argue that moral values must be found in the world, and Wittgenstein's moral views are extremely conservative, if not naive, and somewhat religious. Musing on Nietzsche, for example, he wrote that Christianity is the only sure way to happiness, and a later diagnosis of high-functioning autism didn't enhance his moral insight. This is because autism has been described by some as mind blindness. It's also notable that, given Wittgenstein's reported deference to authority, he had attended lectures by G.E. Moore, and Moore at Trinity College, Cambridge, was arguing that the moral good could not be defined. Such circumstances seem to provide explanations of Wittgenstein's methodological pessimism. But there isn't time here to discuss all of Wittgenstein's contributions and detractions from philosophy. Yet what is certain is his huge influence on the philosophy of language as linguistic philosophy. I earlier gave an example of linguistic philosophy that turned philosophical issues into questions about language. Another is turning Socrates' question, "What is mind?" into the question, "What is meant by the concept of mind?" Yet Wittgenstein rejects mind as an inner world because it must be understood as a process embedded in language. And that account can undermine the idea of the mind having its own set of principles like we find in mathematics, logic, physics and biology. Wittgenstein consequently held that philosophical problems of the mind arise because we misunderstand language, and that such problems could thereby be dissolved by linguistic analysis rather than resolved. So Wittgenstein didn't deny that consciousness exists, but he hid it from view and emasculated it. And Bertrand Russell similarly accused Wittgenstein of trivializing philosophy. Wittgenstein truncates consciousness because he airbrushes it out of its subjective and phenomenal experiences. And he highlights how consciousness is embedded in our use of language without including the rest of the world. And he takes this to the point of consciousness giving up its evolutionary, human and philosophical primacy to language to a vanishing degree. Yet we can understand how consciousness might be thought not to exist without Wittgenstein's conjectures. Mundane explanations of this error are due to an amorphous and invisible phenomenon, and that consciousness also lacks conceptualization, language and a perceptive culture. Another more interesting explanation involves the insular structure of consciousness itself. Yet Wittgenstein denied the existence of any such non-linguistic epistemological problems of mind. But the insular structure of self-consciousness apprehends itself in a singular, non-referential or non-standard way. That is, standard perception involves contrast and reference to a background of understanding. For example, a white spot on a white board isn't a spot. It needs a contrast in order to be seen. But consciousness can neither apprehend other conscious beings in the same immediate way that it apprehends itself, nor can it apprehend itself against the background of the same kind of things that it is trying to understand. This results in a non-standard form of apprehension experienced as mysteriousness or denial of consciousness. I've also argued that other structures produce regression and immersion that also explain self-obfuscation. But the above is sufficient to illustrate the method of alternative forms of overlooking consciousness. Despite all this, it is sometimes argued that the idea of consciousness with principles and structures is an afterthought produced by projection, reification or objectification of contingent experiences. But these principles and structures are prior to and necessary preconditions of those thoughts. And this is what I want to argue next. The final observable determination that consciousness exists as more than a language game isn't just that I can affirm my conscious existence with a statement, I think therefore I am, or that I have immediate experiences of those states that constitute consciousness, or that these states are expressed in the institutions of morality, meaning, purpose, aesthetic, romance and religion. But because consciousness exists, it must have properties, and those properties are essential structures like intentionality, temporality and graduation that instantiate indispensable functions. John Searle writes that irreducible intentionality would be fatal to physicalism. That is an argument for the existence of consciousness as distinct from matter. Yet Searle adds that it would be a rather hollow victory for the anti-physicalist if he could defeat his opponent only at the cost of admitting something of which he was equally incapable of giving any satisfactory explanation. But that can be avoided with a more comprehensive structural account of consciousness. My own account is an interactionist theory of mind and a structural account of consciousness as a process through time and as a relation both with itself and with the external world. But to demonstrate that structures are more than just convenient linguistic descriptions, we need to show how they function as indispensable elements of human experience. The idea of structures of consciousness is, of course, replete through the works of phenomenologists like Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. Yet a first structure, intentionality, is necessitated by the fact that consciousness must be conscious of something. Then temporality, as Heidegger's horizon of being, shows that consciousness must always be moving through time. Graduation reveals consciousness as an emergent phenomenon coming into and going out of existence. And divisibility is the basis of the contrast that enables both perception and value to exist. My final and most nuanced example of the denial of consciousness is Sartre's notion of consciousness as nothingness. This is paradoxical because he is one of the most explicit expositors of consciousness and its structures. For example, Sartre unrestrainedly names a multiplicity of features of structures. These include freedom, choice, presence, facticity, value, possibility, negation, and finitude. But I regard these as features or properties rather than structures because they aren't internally inherent or give shape or form to consciousness. Yet the ambiguity that Sartre brings to the ontological status of consciousness is seen in his description of it as not only pure appearance that presents itself as in the world without any hidden essences, but it is also an eruption from within a fissure of being on which it is dependent. In this way, Sartre describes consciousness as a lack, an absence, or a desire for being. Note that Sartre also defines value as an absence or lack that corresponds with his view of consciousness. But this could also be interpreted less esoterically as a cost theory of value of what we want but do not have. And this also doesn't account for substantive value states like love, meaning and value satisfactions. I coined the notion of value states to fill in and to take further this gap in value theory. We will get back to this shortly. Yet Sartre's conception of consciousness is best defined by his account of two kinds of being. These are physical being in itself and conscious being for itself. Physical being in itself is a plenitude or permanence that has independent existence. It has impregnable existence that cannot be deformed, reduced, or threatened. But consciousness, or being for itself, isn't sufficient in itself. It is contingent, finite, and liable to cease existing. The existence of consciousness is always in question or at issue. It is subject to diminution and termination. And according to Sartre, the for itself craves the permanence of physical being in itself. But this desire can never be satisfied or removed, hence mankind is a useless passion. Yet even more negatively, Sartre describes consciousness bringing nothing into existence in its relations with physicality. That is, the relation of consciousness to the rest of being involves an internal negation. This leads Sartre to define consciousness as a being which is the foundation of itself as a lack of being. But human reality is before all else its own nothingness, and that nothingness lies coiled in the heart of being like a worm." Unquote. Sartre thereby has an ambiguous conception of consciousness that draws negativity and non-existence into itself. Yet he also attributes it with structures that determine the trajectory of human life. But an alternative interpretation is possible. That is, we can accept Sartre's view of human consciousness, but we can describe it as insubstantiality. I previously presented insubstantiality as a result of at least temporality, divisibility, and graduation. To explain, temporality produces impermanence, change, choice, responsibility, and anxiety. Divisibility creates problems like personal fragmentation, internal conflicts, and alienation. And graduation means that we not only develop, but also diminish and eventually die. These structures pose the problem of consciousness in terms of its insubstantiality. But instead of accepting Sartre's fixed attitude of the relation of consciousness to the permanence of physicality, we can choose a more attainable alternative in pursuing a sufficiency of value. But that is another discussion, and a whole study of consciousness and value that is the current question. It is 100 years since Husserl said that Descartes opened the door to consciousness but didn't go in. The first step is to establish that consciousness exists as a substantive reality, and then we can go in. My conclusion then is that consciousness does exist and isn't just a language game without an ontology. To show this, we first define consciousness as a collective concept of all our conscious experiences. That is, not as a category mistake, a Cartesian theatre, a homunculus, a soul, an essence, a transcendent entity, pure consciousness, a thinking substance, or the reification or the objectification of an idea. But that the phenomenon of consciousness is all our conscious states, bound together by our personal identity. That is, I can affirm the fact of my existence with the statement, I think, therefore I am, and my experiences are expressed in such institutions as morality, aesthetics, romance, and religion. But more than that, the reality of consciousness is demonstrated by actual structures such as intentionality, temporality, graduation, divisibility, insularity, and insubstantiality. And these structures are both preconditions of consciousness and features that indicate its direction. For example, the fact that consciousness must be conscious of something is described by intentionality. That consciousness is an emergent phenomenon coming into and out of existence is described by graduation. That consciousness is always moving through time is described by temporality. And the contrast that enables both perception and value to exist is described by divisibility. Yet consciousness is nevertheless an amorphous and obscure phenomenon, shown as easy to overlook. So we looked at numerous error theories that explained how that mistake can easily be made. And given the amorphous character of consciousness, it was suggested that the question of its existence should be supplemented with the question of ontological status. The basic model for such was that of matter, mind, and abstraction, drawn from Popper's three worlds. But that model proved inadequate in light of such conceptions of consciousness as Sartre's nothingness as an eruption from a fissure of being. All these accounts undermine the incredible hypothesis that consciousness does not exist as a substantive reality. At which point I can end with another joke. That is, a patient goes to see a doctor and tells him that he is dead. The doctor asks him, do dead people feel pain? The patient says no. So the doctor sticks a needle in him and asks, do you feel pain? Are you dead? To which the patient replied, I was wrong. Dead people do feel pain. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting, or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com. The kind of response that I'm looking for is either a recognition that a clarification has been made of the enigma of human existence, or refutations and criticisms showing how I have been mistaken.